Welcome, everybody. We're grateful to have you with us today. This is the 12th of February of 2022, and this is the Utah Valley Technology and Genealogy Group meeting. We've just had a very nice presentation about searching on Ancestry and Family Search, given to us by Wendy Brimhall. Now we're looking forward to a class taught to us by Stephen Kent Ehat. Let me tell you a little bit about Steve. Oh, first of all, if you're watching this on Zoom, it's a little more interactive. If you're a member of the Utah Valley Technology and Genealogy Group, you can watch this on Zoom, but it's open to the general public on Facebook. And wherever you are, whether you're on Zoom or on Facebook, we'd be interested to know where you're located. Our group now, that since we meet on Zoom instead of in person because of the pandemic, we get people from all over the country that meet. Let me tell you a little bit about Steve Ehat. Steve is he's a California attorney, but he lives in Linden, Utah now. He's been the director of the Linden Stakes, the Linden Family History Center, which serves 6 different stakes of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in both Linden and in Orem. And it's a wonderful resource. If you happen to live in the Utah County area, you're welcome to attend there anytime for their classes or to use their information. But Steve's been a director of that. He's a speaker at many different genealogy conferences, and he's spoken to us several times in the past years as well. Since 1969, he's been involved with genealogy research. He does lots of things with American research, German research, French research, Irish research, Slovakian research, and Italian records. And so he's quite versatile on it. With his legal background, he knows a lot about what's going on with law stuff and probates and all that sort of thing as well. He and his wife, Janine, live in Linden, as I mentioned, Linden, Utah, which is fairly close to Provo. And they have 5 sons and 21 grandchildren. Now, what he's going to be talking to us about today is the following. Let me read you the title of his talk, if I can find it on my tablet here. Let's see, it's Advanced Timelines, he calls it, Advanced Timelines for Truly Committed Researchers. Now, timelines are extremely important in family history. He's going to give us some really good advice on how to do that and what to do with it. Now, if you're on Zoom, you'll be able to watch this live on Zoom, otherwise on Facebook. So Steve, let's turn the time over to you. And so take it away.
Thank you, Donald. Those of you who listened to the presentation given by Wendy Brimhall, it's obvious that she's young and experienced beyond her years, and she gave a very good presentation and lots of good advice on how to conduct research. So I commend her for that and commend you for including her in this morning's program. At the end of her presentation, I think either Gerhard or Donald discussed how many different states these presentations this morning are being watched from. And I hope I don't prove that I'm teaching you from the state of confusion.
You smart aleck.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay, so we're going to talk about timelines, and I'm going to show you a number of different timelines and then focus in on some timelines you may not have tried to use in the past that are extremely helpful to you in performing research. So I'll speed through a few things and then slow down a little bit. Let's see if I can get my First, I'll talk about a couple of timelines that can be used to study the lives of individuals or understand records that you have discovered about individuals. Here's a timeline that can be created with software that's found on the website Genelines, Genelines. And as you can see, the researcher here went through and put together information about John Adams, both his health history, his personal history, his occupation, relationships with people in his family, and his religious affiliations. These types of timelines are, of course, helpful to get a visual idea of what happened in a person's life, an overview of the person's life. You'll see the timeline across the top showing every 4 years in John Adams' life. We're all visual. Some of us are helped more by visual than by text. And so this type of a timeline is very helpful. Same thing can be done that shows not only the history and occupation and relationships and religion, but also the residences. Very important to keep track of where a person was at various periods of time. Also something that was created in Genelines. And of course, those of you who use Ancestry, notice that on the left-hand side of somebody's individual facts page, you can see that a timeline is created by the sources that are listed in the second column. And that's a very helpful timeline for you when you're not only trying to figure out what a person did during his or her life, but also what records support the various entries on the timeline. And this is a sample, as all of these are, of garbage in, garbage out, or gem and nugget in, gem and nugget out. It's as good as what it relies on. Family Search has a similar type of timeline showing members of a family, but it's more in the sense of a family descendancy chart, but you can see that it operates a little bit like a timeline. You can go into your own software. Here's an example from Ancestral Quest, where they have recently, I think within the last year or year and a half or so, added a tab across the top, which is a timeline for an individual. And it relies on dates that are in the database that you've created on your own computer, and gives you both dates and places. Timelines can also be applied to families as opposed to just individuals. For example, here's a timeline that someone created, and you'll notice that it has females in pink and males in blue, has their names and the birth year and the death year if available. And it gives you a visual representation of the overlap in the time span of a person's life with other people in the family. It doesn't give other data on the timeline, but for its purposes, it might be something that's helpful to you. And these types of timelines can be created in software that you can get from companies. And most of these timelines can be found in the websites and software available for making them easily locatable by a simple internet search on the words timeline and the phrase family history, or timelines and the word genealogy. Here's one that's created by some software, and you notice it goes on and on and on. I'll show you only the top portion of this timeline, and you can see that the person here has entered a number of items about this family, the descendants of William Brown Hageman or Hageman. And you can see the overlaps in lifespan of the various people that are included in the timeline. Whether this is helpful to you or not in any circumstances, mostly dependent on what your needs are. Here's another example where a timeline pretty much does the same thing. And you can see that this is by gene lines again.
Steve, where was that one that you just showed a minute ago that overlapped with all of that one? Yeah. How was that constructed?
In software, but I'm sorry, I don't remember where I got it. But if you were to go onto Google and in the upper right-hand corner, choose images as opposed to Gmail or anything else. If you choose images, you can do an image search on genealogy timelines, and you will see a large number of images of timelines, and this will be one of them.
Is this a free one or is it a pay one?
You know, I can't remember. Sorry.
Okay. That's a great illustration. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, you bet. This again was the one from Gene Lines. This one I found, I think, probably with one of those image searches. Notice what the researcher did here, representing a person's birth and death with a green line. Unfortunately, the green line, for example, if you look at the very top green line, it goes and gets obscured by the black line that is part of the pedigree itself. But you'll notice that that black line actually extends out a certain distance for the husband in that first couple. And for the wife, it extends out not as far. And in that manner, the person has been able to represent the time span from birth to death for that individual. So to the extent that this might be helpful to somebody who does research, go for it. I didn't find it to be all that helpful, but it goes to show that a lot of people have developed a lot of ideas on how timelines can be formulated. This is one that's associated with a pedigree chart. It'll ignore all of the other children in a family group except for the one family, or excuse me, the one individual through whom your family descends. And of course, this is a very simple descendancy chart, but it forms a sort of timeline simply because it has dates on it. But any one generation, for example, the third generation down, which refers to 2 daughters, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 monarchs, it has their dates, but they're not offset from one another. They're all on the same horizontal line. So to an extent, it's helpful. To an extent, it's not helpful. But it's a historical representation, and you could say that it is a timeline. So you could create one of these for your own monarchs in your own family and take pride in when they lived and what crowns they wore. This is referred to as a timeline of the descendants of William Rossiter, probably misnamed because it's not all of his descendants. It's probably only the descendants through whom the researcher descends. So if you start at the bottom, you'll see Thomas Rossiter, 1843, and then Ambrose Whitman Rossiter. Maybe that's an older brother, I don't really know. And then above that, Elizabeth, maybe that is some other relative that's not listed as does not have Ambrose listed as a child. So I'm not exactly sure who all is on this, but you could create a timeline like this for simple purposes of giving you a visual representation of descendants, or at least of family relatives who are in your pedigree or in your database. Family Search has had for quite some time and still has its own little timelines on the bottom of your details page, showing, for example, here, my birth, my christening, the death of my mother, my marriage, the birth of our 5 sons, and the death of my father. Those are helpful, and that individual timeline can be enhanced with other data that you put into Family Search. I'll give you one example of a timeline for records. I'll show you another example, I think, later on in this presentation. But it's always helpful to know what records exist and what time periods those records cover. Here's a timeline that's on the Norway Heritage website showing records that are relevant to passenger lists and ships that crossed the ocean. And so you'll see immigration records and customs service records, immigration and naturalization service records, and the years that are covered by those records. Now I'll slow down a little bit and go into some timelines that are used as an aid to research. And I hope you find this to be very helpful to you if you're truly committed to doing research, because using timelines in the manners that I will describe from here to the end of the presentation, you'll realize that you may have researched what you think you should have researched. And once you set up a timeline, you might realize that you need to go back and do the type of research that Wendy Brimhall was referring to, sometimes page by page and book by book research. Accurate timelines of the type that I'm going to show you will help you analyze the data you already have. You'll create these timelines from research you have already done and data that you've already put into your database or kept in your records and put in your files. And of course, you'll be able to add to it once you seek new data, now in a more productive way, because the timeline will guide you in doing better research than you have done in the past, at least potentially. And it'll help you to estimate dates of events a lot more accurately than you may have done in the past. And that'll help you, as you'll see from a couple of examples, to enhance your research, expand your research, or limit your research based on what the timeline actually shows you. I see a message popped up that says that Denise Marion has entered the waiting room and it says admit or view. Should I click admit or somebody else hit admit?
We took care of it.
Okay, I'll hit X. Thank you. So here's a textual timeline for Sophia Christ. She's my great-great-grandmother. Here she shows up on the 10th day of June in 1880 in Mud Springs Township, El Dorado County, California. And as you can see, that it says she was born in Germany, and it says her age at the time of this enumeration was age 60, which means that if this was enumerated on the 10th of June, 1880, and she indeed was age 60, she would have been born between the 11th of June, 1819, and the 10th of June, 1820, assuming that the day of the enumeration of the census was her birthday, or at some time in the prior 364 days, she experienced her 60th birthday. So I put together a timeline where in the left-hand column, I state that this record indicates that she was born between 11 June 1819 and the 10th of June 1820, and I give the text that supports that date. In other words, the event was born in Germany, and the source is the 1880 US federal census. If I go to the 1870 census enumerated on the 26th of July, I get an entry that would indicate that she was born between the 27th of July, 1822 and the 26th of July, 1823. Again, the data, born in Germany, and the source. 1860 census shows her to be 37 years of age, born in Hanover, Germany, and I made sure to check every single entry by this assistant marshal who served as the enumerator, Richard Reed. I checked every enumeration that he did in the entire county, and every time he referred to a place in Germany, he referred to the state, not the city. So I know it's in the province or the kingdom of Hanover that she was born in, if this is accurate. So her age is 37, and that would mean that she was born between the 13th of July, 1822 and the 12th of July, 1823. And the data is that she was born in Hanover, Germany, and the source is given. Same thing with her petition for probate of will, says how old she was. So she was probably born, if that record is correct, between 28 June 1819 and 28 June 1820. Actually, that should have said, I guess, 27 June 1820. And in her entry in the 1850 US Census, she's given as the age 28, so she would have been born between the 23rd of July, 1821 and the 22nd of July, 1822. Obviously, as is the case with most records relating to an individual, references to their age at a certain time indicate different conflicting dates or estimated dates for their birth. And she has an obituary stating that her birth date itself was the 6th of January, 1820. So if I go through and put all of those together in my timeline, this is a textual timeline. You can see that she was probably born between the 11th of June, 1819, or the 26th of July, 1823, or somewhere in between there, possibly on the 6th of January, 1820. So in one of my textual outlines, I just simply say, okay, I'm going to go with the 6th of January, 1820, because that's a pretty specific date, might be correct, might not be correct. And so I put it in an annotated chronology, and you can see that in the left-hand column, I put all of the dates, including that date that is so specific. And of course, I put all of the places that are associated with those dates. So this is a very helpful timeline to have for this purpose. And it's just simply to basically, in the reason I put this one together was to communicate with my family what the results of my research were about her entire life. But as you can see, it's page 1 of 10 down at the bottom. But there's only 2 pages of text about her, plus 1 entry on the 3rd page. That's really all I know about her. But I have all of the footnotes about the sources I relied on to create those 2 pages and 1 entry of timeline for her. And notice the first footnote is where I put together all of that information about all of the conflicting information about her birth year or birth date. And so it's helpful in the sense that it's not visual, it's textual, but it still constitutes a timeline, and it's supported by the footnotes. And the footnotes go on, including a footnote, for example, about the birthplace of one of her sons. And the records conflict whether that son was born in Wisconsin or Iowa or in Racine, Wisconsin, or as it happens to be, Iowa County, Wisconsin. And he ended up being born in the state of or territory of Iowa. And the footnotes continue on for the full 10 pages. And that constitutes a textual timeline for her. Now, here's a similar textual timeline for a man named James Shepard. And it became
my red purse.
I don't see it from here.
I'm hearing some talking. Is somebody asking a question? I'll continue.
That was a mistake.
That's no problem. I just wanted to not miss a question. Feel free to ask any questions at any time.
So Stephen, I
Yeah.
was just going to make a comment that especially when we go into military records, you'll have multiple people with the same name. And so these timelines are just really valuable to help you to separate contemporaries and find your person. And so I am delighted that you're going into this. So
Very
thank you.
good comment, Marilyn. Thank you so much. So here's a man named James Shepherd, and he happens to be either an ancestor or a sibling or something like that of an ancestor of a woman who lived with my sister back when they were both in a foster home in the early 1950s. And she needed to find information about this man, James Shepherd. And so I went in and found out that he happened to be a Civil War what's the word? Well, he fought in the Civil War.
He's a veteran.
Invalid.
Veteran.
Yeah, there we go, veteran. And he filed an invalid pension because he got injured by running into a cactus of all things and really suffered. And so the timeline gets very, very involved. But notice what happens when you really go into the records, and in this case, into his invalid pension application records. I put together, again, one of those textual timelines where I've got the dates and the places, and I just give the information or the quote from the record or whatever, and it gets into a lot of detail. And the records that I obtained from the government, the federal government, for his invalid pension application were very, very extensive and very readable. And I went through just word by word and copied or quoted. It was 377 pages like this. And I created that textual timeline. And you can see it just goes on. There's 42 pages. And I would quote from the information and put it into the timeline. And I'd be jumping back and forth as I created the timeline, because one thing would be from the 1860s, another thing would be from the 1900s, another thing would refer to something in the 1840s. And I just put together the timeline, and we'd go on and on and on, as you can see. And having run into this fact that he fought in the Civil War and that these records were available, I was able to come up with an extremely detailed timeline or textual timeline for him based on those records, and far more pages than I know about my own great-great-grandmother, as you saw from Sophia Christ. So we get here to even into the 1900s and the research there. So it goes on for 29 pages, and then the footnotes show up. Now I'm going to show you 2 pages of this of these endnotes here, where you can see that chart there. And then I'm going to discuss something for a moment. Then I'll finish showing you the rest of the endnotes. You notice in this chart here that there were conflicting reports on when and where he was born. And that's, of course, common. So in the left-hand column of this chart, I put what the source was. I put what the place of that source was. And then I put what the birth time was reported in that source, what the birthplace was reported in that source, and what the name used for him was in that source. And you notice that his name switches back and forth between George Lehman and James Shepherd. And that chart finishes on the second page of the endnotes and goes on. I found on the internet a very helpful video by Ann Mitchell. She goes by the screen name or whatever of Ancestry Ann, and apparently she works for Ancestry.com. And if you go on to YouTube and search for the phrase Ancestry, Ann Mitchell, timelines, this will pop right up. And she goes through and discusses a timeline that she uses for her research purposes. It's a very good presentation, lasts about 15 minutes. And you notice what she does in the left-hand column is she gives the dates and the location for a certain event in a person's life, and then what the information is that she gleans from the record or records pertaining to that person at that time in that place. And then in the third column, she records what her thoughts are, what things that she plans to do relating to that information. And she keeps it kind of like as an ongoing research outline and suggests that you can do the same. You can add and subtract information in the third column. You can add and subtract information in the first and second columns so that it becomes a very helpful timeline, more or less like research timelines that most of us used to use and some of us may still use. And so that's a very helpful thing. And that's akin to what I was doing here in the sense of keeping track of what records said and what dates they associated and what places they associated with a person. And here's the rest of the notes for James Shepherd. And that's the end of the notes. But one of the things I passed by as I went through those notes was the fact that on page 46 of the 377 pages of his invalid pension application, there was this affidavit by a man and woman, husband and wife, John Bradford and his wife, Apollina Bradford of New York, Rochester, Monroe County, New York, who stated in their affidavit that they are well acquainted with the man, George Lehman, whose name was, while in California, James Shepherd, and who lived in California and served in the Army under the name of Shepherd and changed it to George Lehman. Well, this was a gold mine hidden in one affidavit, and there was a small scrap of paper that confirmed it, not associated with anyone's name or date. It just simply confirmed that his name at one time was George Lehman and another time James Shepherd. And so forced to put together a timeline to understand this man and why I couldn't find record of him being born either in New Jersey or in New York, as all of the records otherwise stated, just by having forced myself to put together this detailed timeline, I was able to discover that his name was not as my sister's friend learned him to be, but that his name was a different name when he was born. And apparently, I don't know for a fact, his name went from George Lehman to, when he went to California, James Henry Shepherd, and then back to George Lehman. Even though when he died in California, he died as James Shepherd. So that's up in the air. I didn't follow through on that research because my sister's friend took it from there. Now, this type of research timeline is going to be extremely helpful to you if you ever put one together. And the only thing I can say is fasten your seatbelts on how this type of a timeline helps you in your research. This is my grandmother. I believe that wedding is a picture of her wedding dress. And in 1914, when she was somewhere in the range of about 30 or more years of age. And this is a timeline that will be helpful to determining when she was born. Her death certificate says she was born on the 3rd of September, 1883. So I put together a timeline up at the top. You can see that I have the years from 1879 to 1886. I chose those years simply because the records that I had already researched indicated to me she was probably born between 1879 and 1886. If I were to find another record beyond that timeline, of course, then I would expand the timeline. And I used a fixed font to represent each of the months underneath each year: January, February, March, April, May, June, through December for each year. And I put an asterisk for the month of September. Looks like I may have put the asterisk under October for this PowerPoint presentation. Sorry about that. Indicating when her death certificate says she was born. Her special teacher's credential application stated that she was born on the 3rd of September, 1883. So I put an asterisk there as well. She applied for membership in the San Francisco Art Association and said that she was born on the 3rd of September, 1883. Of course, she was not a sentient human being on the day of her birth, so she had to rely on what others told her or what she may have gleaned from other sources, whether it's be her parents or other records or something, to conclude that she herself was born on the 3rd of September, 1883. But that's what she said throughout her life. Here's a page from her diary, and you can see down on the first full entry, Thursday, September 3, which happens to be 1903, she states, "Today was my birthday." So her personal journal says she was born on the 3rd of September, but notice that it did not say how old she was. So on my timeline, I put stars for each year representing the 3rd of September, but I don't know the year. You'll find this to be helpful when you see the result of this timeline creation exercise. Her marriage license in San Francisco, if you go down to the 4th and 5th lines or 5th and 6th lines of the text, you can see it says Elizabeth Madeline Ferrea White, aged 30 years and past. And so because it only says that she was aged 30 years and past, I need to go back 30 years to July of 1884 and then put asterisks to the left of that, showing that she was born somewhere during that period of time. And then here she is in the 1920 census, and it shows her age. She's the 3rd line down as age 38 on the 9th of January, 1920, which is not only the date of the enumeration, but apparently very close to the 1st of January, which was by statute the enumeration date. And she was 38 years of age according to that record, so she would have been born between January of 1881 and January of 1882, if that record is correct. 1910 census, you can see that she's referred to as age 28, poorly written, enumerated on the 3rd of May. So she was born between May of 81 and May of 82. Go to the 1900 census, and it was enumerated on the 9th of June, 1900. And you notice that she's enumerated on the 4th line down, gives her birth month and birth year as September 1880, not 1883. And the informant was probably her mother, maybe her father. And notice that it conflicts with all of the other dates that we have seen up to this point in time, except for the one that was her marriage record that expands it all the way back to the left-hand edge of the timeline. States that she was born in September of 1880. Her tombstone at the Holy Cross Cemetery says she was born in 1883. That likely came from the information she relied on throughout her life, where she said she was born on the 3rd of September, 1883. So here's a timeline that is a representation of the results of all of the research in all of the records. The asterisk on the top row represents multiple records, as you recall, because throughout her life, she mentioned numerous times that she was born on the 3rd of September, 1883. But you can see that it conflicts with a few other records here and there. And then if you go to the 1880 census, let me back up a second. You can see that it extends all the way to January 1879 and conceivably even beyond that to earlier dates. If you go to the 1880 census, where the family was enumerated in San Francisco on the 3rd of June, 1880, she's not listed. Her 2 older brothers are listed, but not her. And so, because she does not appear in the 1880 census, you can lop off all of the asterisks that appear earlier than June of 1880, which is what I do there. So that's the finished product of this research outline up to this point in time. And I happened to use that at the time when I was researching parish by parish in San Francisco. And I found this record that the parish priest allowed me to photograph back in the 1980s. And it says that in the year 1881, on the 22nd day of January, he baptized Elizabeth Ferreira, born on the 9th of October, 1880, of Joseph Ferreira and Virginia Riso. And the godparents were Franciscos Riso et Madalena Riso. And so with that, it's a record, it's the earliest in time that mentions an Elizabeth Ferreira of these parents, and I know they are the right parents. Baptism in 1881, birth said to be on the 9th of October. So you've got from October to January, a period of November, December, 2.5 months after the birth, you've got the baptism. So it could be accurate. It's probably more accurate than everything else that we've seen. So we put it into the timeline and we see that it basically disagrees with everything, but it is very close to being reliable. But you notice that because all of those asterisks appear both separated and conjoined on all of those horizontal lines, this is not the end of my research. That record was found in St. Peter's Parish in San Francisco. But as you know from your own research experience, a Catholic family and other families will name a second child after the first child if the first child happened to die. And if she did not live beyond the 22nd of January, there could be a younger sibling given the same name after January of 1881. And so what I do, of course, when I'm going through not only St. Peter's parish registers, but other parish registers in the city where she could have been baptized or another younger sibling could have been baptized, I'm checking all of the years after October of 1880, or basically 9 months after that. But I found out from researching all of the available parish registers that no other person by this name with those parents appears in the records. And so I conclude this research, aided by this timeline, that indeed the 1881 record of the October 1880 birth is indeed of my grandmother. And so back to the 1880 census where she doesn't appear, she actually does appear. That's her mother. And her mother is 4 months and 6 days away from giving birth to her. The census was enumerated on the 3rd of June, 1880, as it shows down at the bottom. And the birth occurred on the 9th of October, or thereabouts, as recorded in the baptismal record. And that was 4 months and 6 days later. So the mother was about 5 months along, 4.5 months along with her daughter, Elizabeth, my grandmother. This is a similar type of a timeline research, but what this does is it compares timelines between America and Italy. And if you're dealing with the crossing of the Atlantic on one of your research projects and you're using a timeline to help you, you might end up using two different timelines and you'll need to compare them. So this is a timeline from American records for Giuseppe Ferrea, the father of my grandmother, my great-grandfather. So from records that I glean over the years, I was able to, between about 1967, when I first went to the Holy Cross Cemetery to find his burial plot, and about 1978, I believe, I was able to glean that he was probably born between 1845 and 1853. I later expanded that to 1855, and I started to put together a timeline for what the records said about his possible birth date. So his obituary, published twice in the Morning Call newspaper, said that he was aged 43 years and 10 months when he was deceased on May 11, 1893, from which you can glean an estimated birth in June or July of 1849. At the time of his death or sometime after that, a marble cover was placed over the underground burial vault of his burial of him and his family in the Holy Cross Cemetery, and that cover stated that he was aged 43 years, 10 months at the time of his death on May 11th. It erroneously states May 13, 1893. And so if that is true, then that confirms what the obituary stated and probably relies on the same source of information, that he was born in June or July of 1849. The burial record itself in the cemetery offices states that he was born, that he was aged 43 years and 10 months of age when he died. So that likewise gives you an opportunity to calculate a birth in June or July of 1849. So those three American records created at the time of his death lead you to believe that he was born in June or July of 1849. The only census he appears in is the 1880 census. He was born sometime in the period of the 1840s or 50s and died in 1893 and doesn't, of course, appear in any existing 1890 census. And that 1880 census states that he was aged 30 at the time of the enumeration. And the enumeration was June 1st of 1880. And so you glean that he was born between June and May of 1849, 1850. And that happens to be consistent with his obituary and also the marble cover over his underground burial vault and the cemetery records. So far, so good. When he registered to vote in 1882, he stated his age was 34. And that was, the registration occurred on August 23rd of 1882. So just as is common with all of your research, so we see here inconsistency, and it's instead of 1849, 1850, it's 1847 to 1848 between August and August. 3 more registrations to vote. One in 1886, he registered on August 9th, reported his age as 36, and therefore he was, if that record is correct, born between August of 1849 and August of 1850. When he registered to vote on September 25th of 1888, he gave his age as 40. And so if that record is correct, he was born between September of 1847 and September of 1848. And finally, he registered to vote in 1890. He died 3 years later. And his registration date was October 15, 1890, gave his age as age 42. And you calculate his birth, if that record is correct, to be between October of 1847 and October of 1848. So based on those 6 records, we glean that his birth was probably sometime between 1847 and 1850. And in fact, a good possibility because of the reference to his age being 10 months and any number of years, probably 43 years. He was born in either June or July of 1849, or possibly even June or July of 1848, if these records are correct. Now we move off to the Italian records. I went to 2 parishes in Italy, and the parish priests in those 2 parishes allowed me to photograph all of their records. In one parish, I went on 2 occasions and photographed records between 1605 and 1911, I believe. And of course, I was able to not only extract names, but to create a timeline from those Italian records. I photographed them all, brought them home, and feel blessed to this day for the unparalleled access to those records. The first time I went to the one parish, I, of course, asked, I only had a couple of minutes to photograph records in 55 minutes. So I talked with the priest beforehand, and after Mass, he allowed me to spend those 55 minutes and photograph records from 1845 to 1855, 11-year period of time, so that I could find all people with the name Giuseppe Ferrea in those records, hoping that this parish might possibly be the right one. And I looked at this parish because my research before going to Italy revealed that there were about 16 places in Italy where the surname Ferrea came from, and 2 of those places that were most notable were Ferriere and Tasso, both of them located in the Comune di Lumarzo. And I focused on those simply because all records seem to indicate that people in San Francisco who happen to have the Ferrea surname, who did come to America, indicating where they came from, said that they came from Lumarzo. So I went to the Parroquia di Santa Margherita in Tasso and was allowed to photograph those 11 years of atti di nascita e di battesimo, the acts or records of birth and baptism of that parish. And Father Agostino Campodonico allowed me to photograph those 11 years of records. And later, when I went back on a second trip, he allowed me to photograph all of the records from 1605 to about 1911, I believe it was. And I showed him how the digital copies of the records could actually be enhanced so that what you could read, or what you could barely read on his original records, could be enhanced to readability using Photoshop software. And of course, I shared the digital images with him. I also went to the neighboring parish of Lumarzo itself, which is the village in the community Lumarzo. And it's the capital of the community Lumarzo. And I photographed all of the records from 1843 to 1855 of everyone who had the Ferrera and Ferrea surnames to see if I could find reference to Giuseppe. And it ended up being Tasso was the best place to go. This is Father Pier Giorgio Moti of the Lumarzo parish, who allowed me to photograph his records as well. And later on a 4th trip to Italy, I photographed his records from 1617 to 1945. And I'm grateful that I have those as well on my computer. So back to Tasso, the very first place I went. This is the 11 years of records that I was able to photograph on my first trip to Italy. And I found a Giuseppe born in December of 1844, baptized in January of 1845. I found a Giuseppe baptized in March of 1846, a Giuseppe baptized in October of 1848, and a Giuseppe baptized in May of 1851. And so, of course, I need to put together a timeline of the Italian records. And I have these 4 dates to start out with. And I'm wondering which one of these 4 Giuseppes could possibly be my Giuseppe. And so here is my American timeline. You can see that the American records, few as there are because of the San Francisco earthquake and fire in 1906, suggest that he was born sometime between 1847 and 1850. Notice the 4 Italians that come from my Italian research. Only one of them falls in that period of time. So this gives me an indication that I might be onto something here regarding that 3rd person. So I returned to Italy to obtain the records of deaths. That's my 4th trip to Italy, where I go to my 2nd trip to Italy, where I go to Tasso to get the balance of records between 1605 and about 1911. And because I'm getting the records of deaths, I can figure out who died when. The first Giuseppe was born in December 44, baptized in January 45, and died at 6 months of age in July of 45. So I know it's not him. The second one was born in 46, married in Tasso, lived there his entire life, and died as a 54-year-old man in December of 1900. So I know it's not him. So my gold mine person, Giuseppe, who agrees with the American records, was born in Tasso in October of 48, married there, lived his entire life there, and died there as a 48-year-old man in May of 1898. So I know it's not him. So there we go. And the timeline, of course, leads me to the 4th one. He happened to have a father named Stefano. He disappears from the Tasso records. He disappears from Italian records. So maybe this is him. And it's important that he had a father named Stefano. This is based on the Italian records. There's no San Francisco record that says that my Giuseppe had a father named Stefano. But there is a San Francisco City Directory entry in 1878, before my great-grandfather died, that refers to a Stephen Ferrara, a gardener living on the west side of San Jose Road near St. Mary's College. Well, that happens to be the very area in San Francisco where my great-grandfather was enumerated in the 1880 census, which was 2 years later. Stephen Ferrara doesn't show up in the 1880 census. This is the only entry in any San Francisco record that is available that refers to a Stefano Ferrara. So I go to the Italian notary records, and I find provably a record for the father of that Giuseppe that was born in 1851, not knowing if that Giuseppe was or was not my great-grandfather Giuseppe. And this Stefano Ferrea, fu Giuseppe, his father's name was Giuseppe, was deceased at the time, shows up in 1877. This happens to be 1 year prior to when the Stefano or Stephen Ferrara shows up in the San Francisco City Directory. So there's a very good possibility that they're one and the same person, and that this person left Italy. There are no emigration records from Genoa at this period of time. They were destroyed, and so I can't confirm that he actually went there, but that happens to be a record of his sale of real property. And so good possibility that he sold this property, because I know from genealogical research on his family that his wife died the month prior. So maybe what happened was he sold his property a month after his wife died, and possibly went to San Francisco, got named in the city directory there, and then either died in San Francisco and there's no record of his burial there, or an obituary or any other reference to him, only that one city directory entry, or he may have returned to Italy and died there. Unknown. So prior to 2011, I decided to go through all of those records that I had acquired between 2006 and 2010 in my first 2 trips to Italy. And I traced that Giuseppe, who was born in 1851, and I followed through on who he was, who his father was, who his father was, his father, and his father, because what I wanted to do was Y-DNA analysis, going to the underground burial vault where this Giuseppe was buried in the Holy Cross Cemetery south of San Francisco in Colma, and get his Y-DNA out of his bones, his femur and his teeth, and see if a male to male to male to male descendant of his great-great-grandfather happened to match the Y-DNA of 6 other people buried in that same cemetery who happened to be distant relatives of his, something like 6th cousins, who came to San Francisco and died there. And they would probably have the same Y-DNA simply because it takes about 11 generational events for a modification in the DNA to occur in such a way that it would not reveal relationship. So up until 2011, this was my plan, and I was making monetary plans for a very expensive exhumation of Giovanni, who was buried under his wife Maria. So it exhumed those 2 bodies and exhume Giuseppe Giobata, and it would be, of course, the bones of these people. It was going to cost about $25,000, but I set the money aside figuring I would do this. And lo and behold, right in the middle of 2011, Ancestry announced that it would be commercially available to the public, Autosomal Research. So I bagged the very expensive idea of Y-DNA research and did autosomal research, and there are the results of autosomal research, where the Linda Marie, James J, and Richard A in the bottom left-hand side, and my sister Rosemary and I and my son Patrick and our first cousin Christine, we all subjected ourselves to autosomal DNA tests, and I was able to confirm by what's called triangulation that indeed Giuseppe Giobata, who you can see is shown there in red font as my great-grandfather, he is the same person as Giuseppe, who's in black font in that same box. I'm referring to this box right here. Because we, through Giuseppe, have DNA that matches Linda Marie, James, and Richard, who happen to be cousins of Giuseppe Giobata through his ancestry and down through their descendancy, we are related to them, and therefore we are related to Giuseppe, and Giuseppe Giobata are the same person. And it was because of the timeline I was able to, basically I was forced to rely on DNA analysis, simply because the American timeline and the Italian timeline did not agree. One led me to a period of time between 1847 and 1850, and the Italian records led me to believe he was born in 1851. So he wasn't age 43 years and 10 months. He happened to be age 40 and 10 days. So the 10 months, even though it was etched in marble on his burial marble cover, may have referred to the number of days rather than the number of months. So there you go. That shows that timelines can be very helpful to your research. And if anybody has any questions, I'm open.
Steve, that was just a wonderful illustration of using timelines to get around and to figure out what's going on. I've got a couple of questions or a couple of comments, but let's see if there are any that Gerhard has from on Facebook. Is there anything, Gerhard?
No, no questions on Facebook.
Okay. One of the things I was thinking about during your presentation, Steve, is there a way to use a spreadsheet to use to illustrate some of the timeline, the text timelines that you did?
Yes. As you remember from that footnote in the end notes of the man, James Shepherd, who was the man who fought in the Civil War, that was basically a grid of 4 columns and a number of rows.
Yeah.
And also from that research timeline that was used by the ancestry presenter, that those are grids, and that's what a spreadsheet basically is. And you could use a spreadsheet in that manner if you're so inclined, and add, subtract, multiply, and divide as far as filling things into the spreadsheet. Yes.
Well, I was wondering about where you're using your asterisks and all that sort of thing to illustrate.
Possibly, yeah. I'm not adept at using Excel spreadsheets and those for those kinds of purposes. What I used in creating those timelines happens to have been WordPerfect, which seems a little bit easier to use than Word for these purposes.
Yeah, right.
And definitely when you're creating a timeline in that fashion with the asterisks, you want to use a fixed font like in Courier or Courier New.
Yeah, yes, yeah, because otherwise it's not going to space right.
That's correct.
I love that template, Stephen. Is there a chance that we could reach out to you is that a template you have that you'd share?
Yes, let me do this. I will go right on here right now. Let me save this first, just to make sure any changes I might have made while I was getting ready for the presentation today. I'm going to put in here, oh, this is an image, so I'll just take it off. I'll put in a text box.
You could put that in chat too.
Oh, sorry about that.
But that's
well,
okay.
anyway.
Or we can copy it into chat. But
Yeah,
if we email you at this, then you might send us a copy of that, because that is brilliant. I like the months being included.
Yeah.
Another question I had is continuously there's conflicts on family search because one person's using one record and another person is using another record, and as you said, but it's in granite, so why do you? So have you found that if you put your timeline with the analysis there, have you found that people have been more accepting of your research and your conclusions? Respectful of it, maybe, is what I'm trying to say.
I suppose I'd say yes and no, because some will accept documentary evidence, and some will adhere to preconceived notions that are based more on feeling than on documents. So it depends on the person you're speaking about. I would say this, however, when I was back in, I think about 2006 or so, when I was serving as the director of the Family History Center, the people from Family Search came down. They were still in development of some of the details on Family Search, and they used us as, I guess, test people or whatever, I don't know. And from that point, for a couple of years after that, I think they referred to the place where we now can collaborate. They refer to it as dispute or something like that. And I just kind of cringed at referring to it as dispute. And so to the extent that people can collaborate and make reference to documents, that would be good. That kind of reminds me of something I've always thought would be a very helpful thing to have. And that is whenever you're in your own program on your computer, I use Ancestral Quest, but I have the other programs and use them a little, but Ancestral Quest happens to be my go-to. If you're in a pedigree view and you have a line that goes from one person over to the right and then up and then over to the right to that person's father, or to the right and down and then over to the right to that person's mother, I'd like to be able to actually click on that line and have pop up all of the documentary evidence that you've entered into the database, of course. That confirms that relationship.
Yeah, the relationships, because right now you can put in a date, that confirms a date, but you aren't able to show the documents that are in there.
Another thing that I would really like to have, not only that, both in Ancestral Quest and other programs, but also on Family Search and Ancestry and all this, not only that, but something like the following, where you can enter into your database the birth date or birth year of the oldest child, the birth date or birth year of the youngest child, and if you know it, the marriage date, and then the program itself will use those dates to give you an estimate for the birth year of the mother, saying that you can go back 45 years from or 50 years if you choose, from the date of the birth of the last child, and then about 13, 16, 18 years, whatever you program it to use, from the birth year of the first child. And it will put into your database automatically a temporary estimate of the birth year or birth range of years for the mother. And then when you're going through, say, a compare and merge function, it will use that date and always use maybe a color code or something to represent to you that that's an estimated date, that was given by the program, and use it for purposes of comparison, so that you're not committing yourself to a date, but that the program at least keeps track of what is possible there. And then, of course, you can click something that says, I accept this range of years. Or if you happen to find a record, that will help you determine whether the record is or is not the one that you need. And you can click on a button someplace that puts the date in for you. That'd be a nice feature.
That would be helpful to beginners who really don't understand how to estimate dates. I was going to point out that Family Search has put in a timeline.
Yes.
It's a new feature that wasn't on your PowerPoint.
Actually, it was in this.
You mentioned that. Yeah, you mentioned that. Yeah.
But it
was an earlier version, but
an earlier version. That's what it is. Yeah. And so so now it does have the age of the person when events occur. And I really do like that part of these timelines, is to say at what age were they married, at what age were these children born, at what age did they die.
Exactly.
And so that's another feature of timelines that is really quite helpful.
Yeah,
so.
We're quite a ways over time, but,
Okay.
but let me just mention one other thing that you did not mention here. There's a website called ourtimelines.com, which you can put in a birth year and a death year, and it will generate the world events that occurred in that timeline.
Yeah, and you saw from those samples of the individual timelines that those researchers actually did put in world events, and those are helpful for those who are interested in that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, it clues you as maybe there's a war. Maybe you should start looking for military records, or
Yeah.
maybe there was but it's a completely free deal, and it's easy to use. Very
Yeah.
simple.
Yeah, I think I alluded to this, maybe didn't express it outright,
okay.
but you can go into a Google search and just put in the search timelines and genealogy, or timelines, quote, family history, end quote, and you'll be off and running when it comes to finding software that helps you, websites
Right.
that help
Yep.
you, and what have you, and suggestions.
I have one other question. Back when you were talking about Elizabeth, you had quite a few records you were looking at times from. The marriage record of her used a term I hadn't run across before. She was listed as 30, I interpreted it as 30 something, the way you put the asterisks on the chart. What was that term?
30 years and over. Let me go to the text of it right there. Here it is.
I thought that it used a different term than that. I thought it might be a legal term that was used.
Here it is. Elizabeth Madeline Ferreira White, aged 30 years and past.
And past. That was, I hadn't run across that before. So that means it could have been anything over 30. Is that what that means?
Yeah, that's correct.
30 and over.
Yeah.
Okay.
Isn't
Yeah,
that
I
interesting?
seen that before.
Yeah, and it says the same thing about her groom, her husband, Frederick Miller Ehat White, aged 30 years and past.
And past. Yeah, that's different. Thank you.
And then it's pretty nebulous, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
but that's better than nothing, right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, wonderful. Well, that was a wonderful presentation with lots of good ideas on using timelines for us. Lots of things to think about there. Any last minute questions? And hearing none, and there's none, Gerhard, are there anything else on Facebook?
Okay, I'm grateful
No,
to everyone.
well, there was one comment that came up late. Elaine says, thanks, an interesting use of timelines. Very helpful.
Good. Okay, wonderful. Well, we
By the way,
appreciate
one
you.
other quickie comment, Don.
Yeah, go ahead.
Ron Tanner is our main presenter next month.
Oh, good. And that's right after Roots Tech. Be sure you register for Roots Tech. 3rd through the 5th of March is Roots Tech, and that's completely free and virtual. And then right after that, is it the 12th of March? What's the second Saturday in March?
It's the
Ron
12th.
Tanner. Most of you know that Ron is the guy in charge of Family Tree on Family Search. And so that will be an interesting presentation. Thank you very much, Steve. We appreciate all the hard work you did and you went to, and for taking the time to present to us today.
And thank you all for attending.
Okay.